The moment they stepped onto my land without permission, they stopped being neighbors and started becoming evidence. The first thing I noticed wasn't the voices, it was the sound of metal rattling against metal, a sharp, deliberate clang that echoed across my driveway like a warning shot, followed by the low mechanical groan of my front gate being forced open wider than it was ever meant to go, hinges protesting under pressure, and then the crunch of gravel under heavy boots, steady, confident, like they already believed they owned every inch they were walking on, including the ground beneath my feet. I was standing 10 yards from my porch when they came into view, 3 of them, navy polo shirts with the HOA logo stitched over the chest, clipboards in hand like badges of authority, and behind them, a white SUV idling just outside the gate, engine humming softly, exhaust drifting through the late afternoon air with that faint chemical smell that always clings to suburban enforcement theatrics. I could taste it in the back of my throat as one of them raised a hand, not in greeting, but in command, like I was supposed to stop, comply, step aside on my own property. "Sir, you need to vacate this area immediately," he said, voice flat, rehearsed, the kind of tone you use when you've said the same line enough times that you forget it actually means something. I didn't move. Not an inch. The sun was hitting the side of my house just right, casting long shadows across the boundary line I had measured, surveyed, and documented down to the last inch, a line they had already crossed, physically and legally, though they didn't seem to realize that yet. Or maybe they just didn't care. One of them stepped closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne, sharp and synthetic, trying too hard to cover something underneath. "You're in violation of HOA community regulations," he continued, flipping a page on his clipboard like it was scripture. "This property is now under review for compliance enforcement." I almost laughed at that, not out loud, just a quiet exhale through my nose. Because there's a difference between confidence and overreach, and these guys were leaning hard into the second one. "This is an HOA property," I said, calm, steady, the way you speak when you already know how the story ends. But they didn't pause, didn't hesitate. If anything, my response seemed to push them further, like they needed to prove something. One of them gestured toward the ground, right near the edge of my driveway where the gravel met the grass. "This entire section has been designated as shared access," he said, tapping his pen like that settled it, like words alone could redraw legal boundaries. And that's when it happened. Not a shove, not anything dramatic, just a hand reaching out, making contact with my arm, guiding, redirecting, as if I were the one out of place, the texture of his grip firm but controlled, the kind of touch meant to assert authority without saying it out loud. And in that exact moment, everything shifted, not emotionally, but legally, clean, precise, irreversible. I looked down at his hand, then back up at him, and asked one simple question: "Are you sure you want to do this on record?" He frowned, just slightly, confusion flickering across his face like a glitch in a script he hadn't practiced for. Behind him, the SUV engine continued to hum, steady, oblivious, and somewhere in the distance, a lawn sprinkler clicked on, water hissing rhythmically across a perfectly trimmed yard, the kind of peaceful suburban sound that makes people believe everything is under control. But standing there, with 3 HOA officers inside a boundary they had no legal right to cross, I already knew something they didn't. This wasn't a warning. This wasn't a dispute. This was the beginning of a case, and every second they stayed on my land, every word they spoke, every action they took, was about to become the reason they lost everything they thought they could enforce. I did not answer his question right away because the truth is I already knew how this would play out. I had seen this pattern before, not in a neighborhood like this, but in rooms with fluorescent lights and polished tables where people thought paperwork gave them power they did not actually have. The difference here was the smell of cut grass in the air and the faint ticking sound of a sprinkler rotating somewhere behind the fence line, steady and indifferent to the fact that 3 men were standing on land they had no jurisdiction over. I slowly pulled my arm back, not aggressively, just enough to break contact. And the moment his hand left me, I could feel the shift, subtle but real, like a line had been drawn that could not be erased. "Sir, you are interfering with an official compliance action," the second officer said, stepping closer, his boots grinding into the gravel with that dry crunch that always sounds louder when things get tense. He held his clipboard up slightly, as if it were some kind of shield, the paper edges catching the sunlight, crisp and official looking, but paper does not mean authority, not by itself. I glanced past them toward the gate, still wide open, the hinges slightly bent now from the way it had been forced. That gate had been installed 5 years ago. Reinforced steel, custom hinges rated for far more weight than they had just put on it. I remembered the smell of hot metal the day it was welded into place, the slow hum of the generator, the careful measurements down to a 1/4 inch, because boundaries matter, especially when people try to pretend they do not exist. You need to leave, I said, calm, even, the kind of tone that does not ask, it states. But instead of backing off, the first officer shook his head, a small, dismissive motion, like he had already decided how this story ended. This property falls under extended community access regulations, he replied, reading directly from his sheet now, his voice taking on that rehearsed rhythm again. And that was the moment I realized they were not just mistaken. They were relying on information that had been handed to them. Incomplete, maybe intentionally so. Somewhere behind this there was a decision, a push, someone telling them this was allowed. I could almost picture her standing at the edge of the street, arms crossed, watching this unfold with that tight smile she always wore. Caroline Hayes did not show up for the dirty work. She sent people, and those people rarely asked the right questions. The third officer shifted his weight, glancing between me and the others, uncertainty creeping in just slightly. It was there in the way his grip tightened on his clipboard, in the way his eyes flicked toward the property line marker half buried in the grass, a small metal stake most people would never notice. But I had placed it there myself after the last survey. Coordinates verified, filed, recorded. You are trespassing, I said, letting the word hang there for a second. Not raised, not emphasized, just stated like a fact that had always been true. The air felt heavier now, like the heat had settled in around us, pressing down, the faint scent of asphalt from the street mixing with the sharper edge of tension. The first officer let out a short breath, almost a laugh, like the idea itself was ridiculous. We have documentation, he said, tapping the clipboard again, and I nodded slowly, because documentation works both ways. And that is something people forget until it is too late. I reached into my pocket, feeling the smooth edge of my phone, already recording, already capturing every word, every movement, every second they chose to stay exactly where they should not be. And I thought back to the last time I stood in a place like this, watching someone push just a little too far past the line, convinced they were untouchable, convinced the system was on their side. The difference was they had learned the hard way that authority is not about who speaks the loudest. It is about who holds the law. And standing there on my own property, with 3 HOA officers slowly realizing something was off, I could already see the first crack forming in the story. They thought they were in the silence stretched just long enough for doubt to creep in. Not for me, but for them. I could see it in the way the third officer shifted his stance again, his boots grinding a little deeper into the gravel, like he was suddenly aware of every inch beneath him. And that awareness is dangerous when you are standing somewhere you are not supposed to be. I let my gaze drift deliberately to the property marker again, that small metal stake half hidden in the grass, catching just enough sunlight to glint, a quiet reminder that boundaries here were not suggestions. They were recorded, filed, enforced, and the air carried that faint scent of warm soil and cut lawn, the kind of ordinary detail that makes everything feel calm even when it is not. You might want to double-check who authorized this, I said, my voice low and steady, not confrontational, just factual, like pointing out a miscalculation in a set of numbers. The first officer frowned slightly, flipping through his papers with a little more urgency now, the crisp pages making that dry, papery sound that always feels louder in tense moments. We have everything we need right here, he insisted, but the confidence had shifted just a fraction, and that was all it took, because confidence built on bad information does not hold up well under pressure. I watched his eyes scan the lines, looking for something, anything that would reinforce what he thought he knew, and not finding it fast enough. Behind them, the white SUV engine idled on, a steady, mechanical hum that filled the gaps between our words, and from somewhere down the street, I caught the faint echo of a garage door opening. Normal life continuing just a few houses away, while this moment quietly crossed into something much bigger than a neighborhood dispute. Who signed off on extended access? I asked, tilting my head slightly, not aggressive, just curious, like the answer actually mattered. Because it did. The second officer hesitated, just for a second, before answering. The HOA board, he said, but even as he said it, his tone lacked the certainty it had a minute ago, and that hesitation told me everything. They had not verified. They had not questioned. They had just followed instructions. And now those instructions were starting to feel thin. I took a slow breath, the air warm against my skin, carrying that faint mix of asphalt and distant barbecue smoke from somewhere nearby. And I let the moment sit, because timing matters, especially when people are beginning to realize they might be standing on the wrong side of a line. You see that marker? I said, nodding toward the metal stake. All three of them turned to look, almost in sync, and for a brief second, no one spoke. The sprinkler in the yard behind me clicked again, sending a soft spray of water across the grass, the rhythmic hiss cutting through the silence. That line was surveyed and recorded with the county 2 years ago. I continued, still calm, still measured. It separates private property from any HOA jurisdiction. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The words carried enough weight on their own. The first officer straightened slightly, his grip tightening on the clipboard. We were told this section was designated for shared access, he said. But now it sounded less like a statement and more like something he was trying to convince himself of. I gave a small nod, acknowledging the effort. You were told wrong, I said, and the simplicity of it seemed to land harder than anything else could have, because there was no argument in it, no emotion, just a correction, the kind that changes everything once it is accepted. The third officer glanced back toward the open gate, then at the SUV, then back at me, his jaw tightening just slightly, the realization settling in piece by piece, and I could almost see the calculation happening behind his eyes, how long they had been here, what they had said, what they had done, and more importantly, what it meant. I shifted my weight just enough to make it clear I was not going anywhere, the gravel crunching under my boots, grounding the moment. You crossed a boundary without authority, I said, not as an accusation, but as a fact being entered into record, and you made physical contact while doing it. Again, no anger, no raised voice, just documentation spoken out loud. Because sometimes the most effective way to change a situation is not to escalate it, but to define it clearly enough that it cannot be ignored. The first officer's expression tightened, the edges of his confidence finally giving way to something else, something closer to concern. And in that moment, with the gate still open behind them and the quiet hum of the engine filling the space, I knew they were starting to understand exactly where they were standing and exactly how far past the line they had already gone. The weight of that realization did not hit them all at once. It came in small shifts, in glances exchanged without words, in the way the second officer adjusted his stance like the ground itself had become uncertain beneath him. And I let the silence sit there, because silence has a way of making people hear things they would rather ignore. The sprinkler behind me clicked again, spraying a fine mist across the grass, catching the sunlight in a way that made everything look calm, almost peaceful. But nothing about this moment was calm anymore. We were given a directive, the first officer said finally, his voice lower now, less rehearsed, like he was trying to hold on to something that was already slipping. I nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it, because directives only matter if they are lawful, and that is where most people get it wrong. They assume authority can be passed down like a message, when in reality it has to be rooted in something real, something documented, something enforceable. I reached into my back pocket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a folded piece of paper, the edges worn just enough to show it had been handled more than once, the faint smell of ink still lingering on it from the last time I reviewed it. I unfolded it carefully, letting the paper catch the light, and held it up just enough for them to see the official seal stamped at the top. Not flashy, not dramatic, just there, solid and undeniable. This is the recorded survey and jurisdiction filing for this property, I said, my voice steady, the kind of tone you use when you are not arguing. You are presenting. The third officer leaned in slightly, eyes narrowing as he tried to read the details from where he stood. I could see the moment it registered, not fully, but enough to create doubt. And doubt is the first crack in any false sense of authority. That was filed with the county and cross-referenced with state land records. I continued, lowering the paper just a fraction. It clearly defines where HOA jurisdiction ends. The first officer glanced down at his clipboard again, flipping through the pages faster now, the sound sharper, more urgent, like he was hoping something new would appear if he looked hard enough. But it would not, because the problem was not what he had, it was what he did not have. And that is the part people rarely prepare for, the absence of authority where they assumed it existed. The second officer cleared his throat slightly, the sound dry, uncertain. "We were told this area had been reclassified," he said, but the words felt weaker now, like they were losing structure as soon as they left his mouth. I tilted my head just slightly. "Considering that, reclassified by who?" I asked, not pushing, just asking the question that should have been asked before they ever stepped through that gate. The answer did not come immediately, and that hesitation stretched just long enough to say everything that needed to be said. Because if you cannot name the authority behind a decision, then the decision does not hold. I shifted my weight again, the gravel crunching softly under my boots, grounding the moment. "You are standing on privately recorded land," I said, each word clear, measured, outside of any HOA enforcement boundary. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The truth does not require volume. It requires clarity, and clarity was exactly what was settling in now. The third officer took a small step back, almost instinctive, like his body had processed the situation before his mind fully caught up. His eyes flicked again to the property marker, then to the open gate, then back to me, and I could see it. The realization forming, slow but undeniable. Behind them, the SUV engine continued its steady hum, a constant backdrop to a moment that was quietly unraveling. "If that is the case," the first officer began, his voice more cautious now, "then we need to verify this." I gave a small nod, because that was the first correct statement they had made since arriving. "You should have done that before entering," I replied, not harsh, just factual. Because facts have a way of cutting through assumptions without needing to raise their voice. The air felt different now, less charged, but heavier in a different way, like the weight of consequence had settled in. And as they stood there, papers in hand, uncertainty replacing confidence, I knew we had reached the point where the story they believed in could no longer support itself, and everything from this moment forward would be about what they chose to do next, not what they had already done. The shift was subtle but undeniable, like the moment right before a storm breaks when the air gets heavy and still, and everyone can feel something changing even if they cannot name it yet. The first officer lowered his clipboard just slightly, not enough to admit anything, but enough to stop hiding behind it. And that alone told me more than any words could, because people only lower their guard when they realize the ground they are standing on is not as solid as they thought. The distant hum of the SUV engine seemed louder now, filling the quiet between us, and somewhere down the block a dog barked once, sharp and quick, then went silent again, like the neighborhood itself was watching, waiting. "We are going to need to contact the board," the second officer said, his voice more careful now, measured in a way it had not been before, and I gave a small nod, because that was the next logical step, but logic only matters when it is not already too late. I glanced at my phone for just a second, the screen still active, still recording, capturing everything from the moment they stepped through that gate to right now. Every word, every movement, every assumption. And I could feel the faint warmth of it in my hand, a quiet reminder that documentation is not just paper. It is timing. It is context. It is proof that does not forget. "You should do that," I said calmly, my voice steady. "But before you make that call, you might want to understand exactly what has already happened here." The first officer looked at me, his expression tightening slightly, like he was bracing for something he could not quite predict. And that was when I took a slow step toward the property marker, not threatening, not rushed, just deliberate. The gravel crunching softly under my boots, and I pointed down at it, letting the moment settle for a second. "You crossed this line without verified authority," I said, my tone even, almost instructional, like explaining a process step by step. "You entered private property under a claim that does not exist in any recorded jurisdiction." I could see the third officer swallow slightly, his eyes flicking between the marker and the paper in my hand, trying to reconcile the two, but they did not match, and that mismatch was starting to matter. "And you made physical contact while attempting to enforce that claim," I added, not accusing, just stating. Because facts do not need emotion to carry weight. They carry it on their own. The air felt warmer now, the sun dipping just enough to cast longer shadows across the driveway, stretching that boundary line into something more visible, more defined. And for a moment no one spoke, the silence settling in like a confirmation. The second officer shifted his stance again, then reached for his radio, hesitating just long enough to show he was thinking this through now. Really thinking, not just reacting. "We need clarification on a jurisdictional issue," he said. Into the device, his voice controlled but lacking the certainty it had when they first arrived. The static crackled back faintly, and I could hear a voice respond, too distant to make out clearly, but present enough to remind everyone that this situation was no longer contained to just the four of us standing here. It was expanding, becoming something that would have to be explained, documented, reviewed. The first officer ran a hand along the edge of his clipboard, a small, restless motion, like he needed something to hold on to, and I watched him carefully, because this was the moment where people decide whether they double down or step back, and that decision matters more than anything that came before it. "We were told this was standard enforcement," he said finally, quieter now, almost defensive, and I gave a slight tilt of my head, acknowledging the statement without validating it. "Standard only applies when it is lawful," I replied, the words simple, direct, leaving no room for interpretation. And that was when the realization finally settled fully across his face. Not dramatic, not sudden, just there, like a weight he could not ignore anymore. Behind him the open gate creaked softly in the breeze, the metal shifting just enough to make a low, hollow sound, a reminder of how they had entered, and what that entry now meant. And as the radio crackled again in the second officer's hand, I knew the next voice on the other end was not going to make this easier for them. It was only going to confirm what they were already starting to understand, that this situation was no longer under their control. And it had not been for longer than they realized the radio crackled again, louder this time. And whatever came through on the other end made the second officer straighten up just a little too quickly, like someone had flipped a switch inside him. "Repeat that," he said, his voice tighter now, and I did not need to hear the response to know what was being said. I had been on that side of the call before. The moment when someone higher up realizes a situation has crossed into territory it was never supposed to reach. The kind of realization that does not come with shouting, just a shift in tone, precise, controlled, and final. The first officer glanced over at him, waiting, but also bracing, because now it was no longer about what they thought they knew. It was about what they were about to be told. The sprinkler clicked off behind me, leaving a sudden quiet that made every small sound sharper, the faint rustle of leaves, the distant hum of a passing car, even the low creak of the gate as it swayed slightly in the breeze. And in that quiet, the second officer lowered the radio just enough to look at me directly. Something different in his expression now, not confidence, not even uncertainty, but recognition. Like he was starting to connect pieces that should have been obvious from the beginning. "We have been advised to disengage and verify jurisdiction immediately," he said, choosing his words carefully, each one placed with more caution than anything he had said since arriving. I gave a small nod, not as approval, but as acknowledgement, because that was the first correct move they had made all afternoon. But it was not enough to erase what had already happened, and that is the part people always underestimate. They think stepping back fixes the step forward, but it does not. Not when the step forward has already been recorded, documented, and defined. The first officer let out a slow breath, running a hand along the side of his neck, a small gesture that betrayed more tension than he probably realized. "We were not aware this property fell outside HOA enforcement," he said, and there it was, the shift from authority to explanation, subtle, but critical. I tilted my head slightly, considering that awareness does not change jurisdiction. I replied, my voice calm. Even because the law does not adjust itself based on what someone knew or did not know. It simply exists, and people either operate within it or they do not. The third officer took another small step back, this time more deliberate, his boots leaving shallow impressions in the gravel as he moved, creating a physical distance that mirrored what was already happening legally. "We will need to document this interaction," the second officer added, almost as if he needed to say it out loud to confirm it was real, and I allowed a faint, almost imperceptible nod. That would be advisable, I said, because documentation works both ways, and that is something they were finally beginning to understand. The air felt cooler now as the sun dipped lower, shadows stretching further across the driveway, the line between light and shade cutting cleanly across the ground right where that marker stood. And for a moment, all of us were standing on opposite sides of something much larger than a simple boundary. The first officer looked back toward the open gate, then at the SUV, then finally at me, his expression settling into something more controlled, more measured, like he was already thinking about how this would be reported, how it would be explained, how it would be justified. But justification only goes so far when the facts are this clear. We are going to step off the property and follow up through proper channels, he said, and I watched him carefully, because words like that matter, not just what they say, but when they are said. And this was the moment where the situation officially changed direction, not because of anything dramatic, but because the reality of where they stood had finally caught up with them. I shifted my weight slightly, the gravel crunching under my boots again, grounding me in the same place I had been standing since they arrived, the same place they had crossed into without understanding what it meant. That would be the correct approach, I replied, keeping my tone steady, because escalation was never the goal, clarity was, and clarity had been achieved. But as they began to turn toward the gate, moving with a different kind of awareness now, more careful, more deliberate, I knew this was not the end of it, not even close, because what had happened here was not just a mistake, it was a record, and records have a way of resurfacing at exactly the moment people wish they had been more careful. They moved slower now, not because they were told to, but because they finally understood where they were standing, each step toward the gate measured, deliberate, like the ground itself demanded more respect than it had a few minutes ago. The crunch of gravel under their boots sounded different on the way out, less confident, more aware, and I stayed exactly where I was, just inside the boundary they had crossed, watching without saying anything. Because sometimes silence carries more weight than words. The first officer reached the gate and paused for a second, his hand resting lightly against the bent hinge, fingers brushing over the metal like he was noticing it for the first time, the slight warp in the steel, the way it no longer aligned perfectly with the frame, small details that had not mattered when they came in, but now stood out clearly, and I could tell he was thinking about it. Not just the gate, but everything it represented, entry, assumption, consequence. Behind him, the second officer spoke quietly into the radio again, confirming something, his voice lower, controlled, but edged with a kind of urgency that had not been there before, and the reply came back almost immediately. Sharper this time, more direct. Even without hearing the words, I could tell the tone had changed. This was no longer routine. This was being escalated. And that meant someone higher up had started asking the kind of questions that should have been asked before any of this began. The third officer stepped through the gate first, turning slightly as he cleared the threshold, like he was making sure not to brush against anything on the way out. Careful now in a way he had not been on the way in, and that contrast did not go unnoticed. I shifted my weight slightly, feeling the solid ground beneath me, the same ground that had not moved, had not changed, had simply been there the entire time waiting for someone to recognize it. The first officer followed, stepping out onto the street and turning back toward me. His expression settled into something more composed, more controlled, but not the same as before. There was a restraint there now, a recognition that this was no longer a situation he could direct. "We will be in contact after verification," he said, choosing his words carefully, like each one needed to be measured before it was spoken, and I gave a small nod, because that was expected. But it was not the part that mattered most. "Make sure you review the recorded filings before you do," I replied, my voice even, not confrontational, just precise, because if they were going to come back, they needed to come back with the right information, not the version that had brought them here the first time. The second officer lowered his radio, glancing at me for a moment longer than necessary, like he was trying to place something, connect a detail that had not made sense before, and then he nodded once, short and deliberate, acknowledging more than just the statement, acknowledging the situation as it actually was, not as it had been presented to them. The SUV engine revved slightly as the driver adjusted position, the low rumble breaking the quiet that had settled over the street, and one by one they moved toward it, their pace steady but different now, less like enforcement, more like withdrawal. The door opened with a dull mechanical click, then closed again, sealing them inside a space where the conversation would continue without me, but not without the record of what had just happened. I watched as the vehicle pulled away slowly, tires rolling over the pavement with a soft, steady hum. And for a moment the street returned to its usual rhythm, calm, quiet, almost like nothing had happened at all. But I knew better, because what had just taken place was not something that disappeared when the engine noise faded. It stayed. In the recording on my phone, in the bent hinge of the gate, in the exact spot where that property line marker caught the last light of the afternoon. And as I reached out to close the gate, feeling the slight resistance where the metal no longer aligned perfectly, I could not help but think about how small that moment must have seemed to them when they first stepped through. Just another routine enforcement, just another property. But the reality was something else entirely. And they were about to find out exactly how much that difference mattered once the paperwork started moving and the record they had created began to speak for itself. The gate settled back into place with a dull metallic click, not as clean as it used to be, just slightly off, a fraction of an inch that most people would not notice, but I felt it immediately in the resistance against my hand. And that small imperfection stayed with me as I walked back up the driveway, the gravel shifting under my boots in a familiar rhythm, steady, grounded, unchanged, because the property itself had not changed, only the assumptions around it had. And those were already beginning to collapse somewhere beyond the edge of the street. I pulled my phone out and stopped. The recording, the screen still warm, the timeline stretching across several minutes of uninterrupted footage, every word, every step, every moment captured without interruption, and I watched it back for just a second. The sound of the gate opening, the voices, the exact point where contact was made, all of it clear, clean, impossible to reinterpret, and I saved the file with a simple name, nothing dramatic, just a date and time, because documentation is not about emotion, it is about precision. I stepped inside briefly, the cool air of the house a sharp contrast to the fading warmth outside, and the faint scent of paper and ink greeted me as I walked past the desk where I kept copies of every filing related to this property, neatly organized, labeled, accessible, because this was not the first time someone had questioned boundaries here, just the first time they had taken it this far. I pulled out the folder marked with the survey records, flipping through the pages slowly, the sound of paper sliding against paper soft but deliberate, confirming what I already knew, the coordinates, the jurisdictional notes, the county seal, all exactly where they should be, and I set it down next to my phone, aligning the physical record with the digital one. Two forms of proof that told the same story from different angles. Outside, I could hear the distant sound of a vehicle slowing, then stopping, tires rolling over pavement with a soft, controlled hum, and I did not need to look to know who it was. Timing like that is never random. I stepped back onto the porch, the wood beneath my feet warm from the day's sun, and there she was, standing just outside the closed gate now. Caroline Hayes, arms crossed, posture rigid, the late afternoon light catching the edges of her perfectly composed expression, the kind of expression that only holds when it has not been challenged yet. But there was something different now, something tighter around the eyes, like she had already heard enough to know this had not gone the way she expected. The air carried the faint scent of her perfume, sharp and expensive, cutting through the more natural smells of the neighborhood, and she did not step forward. Not this time. She stayed exactly where the boundary line held her. There seems to have been some confusion, she said, her voice controlled, measured, but lacking the effortless confidence it had carried in previous encounters, and I remained where I was, not moving closer, not inviting her in, because position matters, especially now. Confusion usually comes from bad information. I replied, my tone even, steady, not confrontational, just factual, and her jaw tightened. Slightly, just enough to be noticeable if you were paying attention, which I was. My officers were acting on board authorization, she continued, adjusting her stance slightly, like she was trying to reclaim control of a situation that had already shifted beyond her reach, and I gave a small nod, acknowledging the statement without accepting it. Then the board authorized something outside its jurisdiction, I said, letting the words settle between us, clear, precise, leaving no room for interpretation. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before, because now it was not just about what had happened. It was about who had set it in motion, and that is where consequences begin to take shape, not in the moment of action, but in the realization of responsibility. The breeze moved lightly through the yard, brushing against the grass, making that soft, whispering sound that usually went unnoticed. But right now it seemed louder, like the environment itself was marking the shift. And as Caroline stood there, just outside the gate she had not crossed, I could see it in the way her posture held, controlled but rigid, the understanding settling in that this was no longer something she could manage with a directive or a signature. This was something that had already been recorded, already defined, and was now moving into a space where authority had to answer for itself, not just claim it. She did not respond right away, and that pause said more than anything she could have chosen to say. Because people like Caroline Hayes were used to controlling the tempo of every conversation, every decision, every outcome, and right now that control had slipped just enough for it to be noticeable. The late afternoon light had shifted lower, casting longer shadows across the driveway, stretching that boundary line into something almost symbolic, a clear division between where authority stopped and where it had tried to push further than it should have. I rested my hand lightly against the gate, feeling the slight misalignment again, that subtle resistance when metal does not sit exactly where it was designed to. And I let my eyes settle back on her, calm, steady, the same way I had held myself from the beginning. Because nothing about this required escalation, only clarity. This does not need to become something bigger, she said finally, her voice smoother now, measured in a different way, like she was recalibrating, choosing a different approach now that the first one had failed. And I gave a small nod, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it. Because what something needs and what something becomes are not always the same. It already is, I replied quietly, not as a threat, not as a warning, just as a fact. And that was when the tension shifted again, not outward this time, but inward, settling into something heavier, more defined, the kind of weight that comes when a situation moves from assumption into record. Caroline's gaze flicked briefly toward the gate, then back to me, calculating, reassessing, and I could see the moment she realized that this was no longer about managing appearances or issuing directives. This was about accountability, something far less flexible. The breeze moved through the yard again, carrying the faint scent of warm pavement and distant cut grass, the kind of ordinary detail that makes everything else feel grounded, real, undeniable. We can review the filings and correct any misunderstanding, she said, adjusting her stance slightly, her tone now carefully neutral, and I inclined my head just a fraction, because that was the only path forward that made sense, but it was not the part that mattered most anymore. You should review everything, I said, my voice steady, including what happened here today. And I let that sit there, not elaborating, not needing to, because the implication was already clear. The recording, the documentation, the sequence of events, all of it existed now beyond either of our control. Her expression tightened just slightly, almost imperceptibly, but enough to confirm she understood exactly what that meant. Behind her, the street remained quiet, a few distant sounds of everyday life carrying on as if nothing had changed. But standing there at the edge of my property, everything had shifted in a way that would not simply fade. The line had been crossed, defined, and now it would be examined, piece by piece, through channels that did not rely on perception or persuasion, only on fact. I straightened slightly, feeling the solid ground beneath me, the same ground that had never needed to prove itself, only to be recognized. And I met her gaze one last time, not with challenge, but with certainty, because certainty is not loud. It does not need to be. It simply exists. This property has been recorded exactly as it stands, I said, the words calm, final, and today just confirmed it. She held my gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small, controlled nod, the kind of acknowledgement that does not concede, but does not argue either, and without another word she turned, stepping back toward the street, her movements precise, composed, but carrying a different weight than when she arrived, and I watched as she walked away, the distance between us increasing one step at a time, until she was just another figure on the quiet suburban road. And when I finally closed the gate completely, aligning it as best as it would allow, the metal settling into place with a low, imperfect click, I could not help but notice how that small flaw remained, a physical reminder of a moment that could not be undone, because some things, once recorded, do not disappear. They stay in documents, in evidence, in outcomes that unfold long after the moment itself has passed. And as the evening light faded across the yard, I knew this was not about a confrontation that had ended. It was about a process that had just begun, one that did not rely on volume or force, but on something far more precise, far more inevitable, because real authority does not need to push, it only needs to be recognized. And once it is, everything else falls into place exactly as it should.